Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to talk about a camera that I've been shooting a lot lately, and that's the Konica IIIa. I'm not going to go into super depth detail with this review because there's a lot of other videos out there that do a great job with it, especially a channel by the name of japanvintagecamera, which is actually the same guy I bought this particular one from. And this guy knows about everything there is about most of them and does a full review, breakdown, and even repair videos. So definitely check that channel out, japanvintagecamera, and then he's also got an Etsy store where he sells a lot of good equipment, a lot of good camera equipment. So other than that, I just kind of really want to go through just kind of a user review, kind of what I think about this, my experiences with it, and if you're interested in getting a similar one, kind of what to look out for along the way. So anyway, this camera was released around, I think, the mid to late 1950s. There's two versions of this, and one, the US version, was a 50mm f1.8, and then this version here, which I believe was sold in Japan mostly, and that is a 48mm f2. The focal lengths aren't too much difference. Of course, the 1.8 is going to be a little bit faster. The reason I went with the f2 is if you look at the profile of this, the lens is a lot more, it's a lot shorter, because I knew I was going to put a hood on here and everything else. If you don't mind that, then you go with the faster lens. Either way, I think the camera bodies are pretty much the same. The overall build quality on these are fantastic. I don't know how much more you could say about it. I don't know if I have another camera that's built as well as this is. It's maybe a little weighty, but then again, anything prior to 1980s is going to have some weight to it. I know I've seen some videos where they say it kind of weighs like a brick, but I really don't think so. I know it's not as heavy as my Konica T3N. That's fairly heavy. It is a double stroke front mechanism, as you can see on the front here. So the first stroke advances the film about halfway, and the second stroke finishes the advancement, and then it also cocks the shutter. Your shutter control is on a ring on top of the lens here, as is your aperture. And worth noting is this also has a EV system that was attached to it. So when you do buy one, you want somebody to be able to disable that system, and then the aperture ring is going to flow smoothly without stops. There is good instruction videos on YouTube on how to do that yourself, depending on how comfortable you are actually going into the lens after you purchase one of these things. I know japanvintagecamera has a really great video on that. It's probably the one I would go off of if you were going to attempt to do that. Other than that, you got your basic timer right here, your self timer. I always say to avoid using these because they weren't built, in my opinion, for longevity. So I've always heard that they're a failure point on these cameras, on any older camera. The viewfinder in this thing is fantastic, and that's one of the big pluses. It's large, it's bright, it has parallax correction. So it's really easy to see, even with glasses, which for me, some of these older rangefinders, they have small viewfinders. It's kind of tough if you're wearing glasses, but I have no issues at all with this. The advance, or the spool lever over here, tucks away very nicely into the body. And I kind of love that, just aesthetically. I mean, it doesn't, as opposed to just your standard crank lever there. In order to open it, there's actually a knob on the bottom, and you have to kind of flip it open and turn, and then as you push it down, the back will open up, and you'll be able to get inside, obviously, to load your camera up. Worth noting, and I've done it myself, even though I've seen multiple videos telling me not to, is once you close it, you need to turn this back to the locking position and close it, because if you leave it like this and set it on the table, it immediately opens. Keep that in mind. Again, I've watched videos on it before I got the camera, and I still have done it, so you more than likely will too. Outside of that, let's see, a few of the shortfalls on this, because with anything like this, I'm sure there's always a few things that aren't perfect. One is if you want to have a soft shutter release, it's a little tricky because the bridge of the camera drops right down, or the top of the camera drops right down by that shutter release there. And without a soft shutter release, your target point for getting on your finger on that release is a little tricky, and there's not much there to to grab onto. So what I did is I had just a standard wood release that I got off of, I think, Etsy or eBay a while back, and some fine grit, maybe like 120 sandpaper, and just rubbed it on the sandpaper to slowly ground it down to a nice round circumference there that fits in there, and now it works perfectly fine. And you don't see any sanding marks either because you're using fine sandpaper. So it's a quick fix for that, but you're not going to be able to use one off the shelf. You're not going to use an aluminum one or a metal or a brass one like some of the ones that are being sold. Your film counter is right here on the right. Nothing too special on that, really. One other thing to mention is on the right side of the lens there's this little piece of metal that's connected to the shutter release. And for some reason it's exposed within the design. I'm sure there's a reason for that, I just don't know what it is. But if that gets jarred a little too much, it could stick at the lower shutter speeds. I've only had this happen once, and what I did is I put a little moderate pressure back onto it to push it away because it does ride really close to the shutter speed ring. And then I applied a little bit of, it was working fine after that, but then I still applied a little bit of it. I have a full synthetic clock oil that I use every so often. Now you got to be very careful with any sort of lubricants on cameras because I'm sure a lot of thought is like, well, anything can help, but there's these things when they're oiled in the factory many years ago, there's very specific spots in which your lubricant is supposed to go, and if you put a little dab in the wrong spot will ruin it forever. Or you're going to have somebody completely service it and tear it apart, and there's not too many people, I don't think, out there anymore that are qualified to do that. I know I wouldn't probably be able to open this thing up and get it back together. But again, it's only caused a problem 1 or 2 times, and I don't know if maybe I jarred it or maybe I sat it down a little too heavy, but I haven't had the issue since. And I just put that little dab of clock oil just right on that little tong, just so it can slide across that metal shutter ring more smoothly. The other thing that's interesting is the threading on this is a 35.5 millimeter threading, which is fairly hard to find. And I'm not 100% sure, but when I look on Etsy, well, I didn't find anything on Etsy, but when I looked on eBay, most of the stuff is coming from Germany or Russia or Japan. So it's probably a somewhat common threading in the 1950s for fixed lens rangefinders. I was lucky enough to find a UV filter on B&H at that size by a company called Helopan, and of course that's made in Germany. So I did manage to get a nice lens filter on here, and the hood is an older hood that actually I found out of Sweden. So again, it's kind of a little bit hard to find these pieces, and when you find them, they are a little bit expensive because they're not the most common threading like a 49 millimeter or 55 millimeter threading, right? Outside of that, I am running the ttartisan brass light meter on top of it, which is a great little meter. I've been debating on trying one of these things out for a long time, and I've had it now for a few weeks. One thing about the brass model is I did like the idea of it aging. One of the things I love about my Konica T3 is that you can see that brass patina as it gets bumped around a little bit. Is I was hoping it wasn't going to be one of those things where the paint just falls off and looks like crap, but so far it looks really great. I have no marks on it at all, so with time I guess I'll hopefully see a little bit of brass coming through there. It is about a 45-degree angle when it measures, and it's not a spot meter. It's going to basically, you hit the button, there's a button on the back here that activates it, and when you hit that button it's basically going to take a reading at that 45 degrees to bring you to middle gray. Then you can move it around all you want. It's not going to continue to meter, it's not going to change. It's just wherever it's pointing when you hit that button is what it's going to take that reading to middle gray, and then you can move your dials in order to find your correct exposure. One thing I did read about these is that the top here with the ISO control can be a little loose. That could accidentally get bumped. I don't really see that as an issue. It has loosened up a little bit since I've gotten it because, you know, you're using it. But it's one of those things too where you know, you really should be checking that every so often. Especially like with this camera where the aperture is free floating. Now since the EV lock is disabled, it's another one where, you know, I have shot before when I'm thinking that I'm at f2, and then I look down and all of a sudden for some reason I travel to f4. So it's just one of those things I think you just need to be, you know, you need to be looking at from time to time. Outside of that, I'll throw some photographs up that I've shot with it. One thing I will say about this camera that's great, and a lot of these shots are from my up-and-coming photo book that I'm hoping to have done or finished up by the end of 2023, is I've had this camera out in some really harsh environments, and I'm talking like 20 degrees, 20 degrees, 10 degrees, below zero. When I bring it in from those temperatures, a lot of times I'll always put it into a big gallon zip bag of cold air and let it sit in the house for a while so it can equalize, because I think the worst part of those conditions is if you start getting condensation inside your equipment. But outside, I've shot this all winter in some pretty bad temperatures out for a long time, and I've had no mechanical issues whatsoever. Towards the end of this whole thing, I had that little bit of trouble with the shutter catch down there, but again, I think that was more so maybe I put the camera down a little harder than I should have or something like that. I don't think it was weather related. So anytime you take something out in those conditions, you're risking destroying your equipment. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but I really wanted to have it with me when I took those shots, and just happy to say coming out it functioned without a single flaw. So that's a lot to be said about a camera that was probably built around 1956 or 1957. Outside of that, that's pretty much all I have for you guys today. Go ahead and make sure you like the video. Go ahead and click the like button and subscribe for me, because that's going to help me make more videos in the future. Feel free to follow me on Instagram as well. I'm at Akira135 Photography on Instagram, and my website's Akira135.com, and there's more information on there on my photo book and more galleries and stuff that you won't necessarily see on Instagram. But other than that, you guys be kind to each other, and we'll see you next time.